Hey, Dr. Von Duke here with a quick and dirty rubric number one. So rubric one is on task one of the special education at TPA portfolio, and it has to do with question one. Question one has four parts to it, but the guiding question behind question one is basically how does your instructional strategies, whether it's your supports or materials or tasks, align with the learning objective? So how did you choose things that get to the objective that you're trying to have your student reach? How will you measure those learning objectives for your learning goal? And then how are your three learning objectives and related instruction logically sequenced to reach that overall learning goal or some aspect of your learning objective? So it can be something in your teaching that has a logical plan to it. So there's four parts to rubric one. Now, the interesting thing about the rubrics is sometimes the rubric is answered by only one part, and sometimes it's answered across two questions. So you really have to be directed to know where to carefully answer. So in this case, one is a chart, B and D answer the question, and C is information for the reviewer. So 1A asks for the learning objectives and your list of supports, and I've added their measurable outcome because to score, you need to make sure that you include a measurable outcome. 1B then, so that's a chart. 1B asks for a narrative where you describe how your instructional methods, whatever aspect you choose to talk about, and the learning goal, and possibly the IEP, if it also is similar to that learning goal or applies to that learning goal, how they align. Explain any accommodations or modifications if needed, and then describe how the sequence of your instruction is logical. So here you might talk about how one lesson builds on another, or you might simply talk about how your materials change over the course of your lessons, say going from the concrete to the symbolic. And then why does that change for each one make a difference for the student's learning? So for instance, so that's materials. Your supports might have diminished across lessons. Maybe your instructional strategies changed. Maybe you began with direct instruction and then you went to group work and then you went to independent practice. Maybe you included strategies for self-directed learning so that you taught the student how to do it, you watched them do it, and then you left them on their own to enact without any of your support. Did your assessments have a sequencing to them? Did they get harder conceptually? Did the numbers become more challenging? Were more concepts included? Was more of your supports taken away? And then the sequence of your lessons. Did the student need increasing skills to complete a question? Did they build on concepts later that were based on earlier concepts that were taught? Did you use larger numbers? Did you explain how each of the objective leads to your overall learning goal? Now, the thing about this is in order to get three, explaining one of these wells would be enough. One of these areas well would be enough. Especially if your methods changed from lesson objectives. So the TPA really likes to see you talk about what you're doing in each objective, not just in one objective. So say your materials change from objective 1 through objective 3. Well, then what's the logic of that? How does that help the student obtain that learning, right? But if you didn't change what you did across the lessons, say you did the same materials across the lessons or the same kind of supports or the same strategies across the lessons, right? Then you'd want to talk about more than one area. So one area will likely get you 3 and it's very possibly get you a 4, but to solidify your evidence, talk about your materials and your supports or your materials and your sequence of lessons. So at least 2 areas. And then just a thing to be alert about, I'll talk about this in more detail in my courses and alert you across different rubrics where this becomes an issue. But very often I'd say in about half the rubrics, you are told in the special education handbook to go to the rubric that's listed there and follow that so that you can make sure that you get all parts in for scoring. But then if you look at what's in the commentary, sometimes the language is a little bit different. So very often in the commentary, we'll ask you, how does this thing help the student obtain the learning versus what are the things that you used to obtain the learning? So for instance, here it says, how are the plan supports logically sequenced, right? or rather, are they logically sequenced? So you might look at that and you say, okay, are they logically sequenced? Yep, there's my sequence of supports. The logic is clear to me, right? But unless you say explicitly what that logic is, how that logic is happening, then you can't get that score. So just be aware of that discrepancy. And then understand too that in most cases, most of the rubrics, if you'll look at the chart in the special education handbook, have a dotted line. So they'll have a part A and a part B. So 3A and 3B, 4A and 4B. And typically to move to a 4, you have to get a 3, you can just do the 3A part. But to move to a 4, you have to get the 3B part and the 4A part. And then to move to a 5, you need to get the 4B and the 5A. So that's kind of how that works across rubrics, except for rubric 1. In rubric 1, 3A and 4A are exactly the same. So to get to a 4, you have to do the 3B part and the 4A part and the 4B part. So let me go back and rethread this idea now with the scoring requirements. So you'll get a 1 for putting any answer down. It can almost be gibberish, and you'll get, you have a deficit view of the student, you don't like them, you have a goal that's not measurable or misaligned, the goal is one thing and you're using materials related to something else, but you put an answer down. That's a 1. Typically a 2 is loose alignment. So whatever you're doing aligns with the learning goal. It's kind of vague, but yeah, we get it, it's there. And I might look at your lesson plans as a reviewer if I'm really, really nice. And just, yeah, okay, they just didn't say it well. Here's a pitfall warning though. And this is mostly true just for rubric 1. In the special ed TPA, even though it's a special ed portfolio, it's still concerned mainly with the academic learning. The only case where that's not true is where you have a profoundly disabled student who's really not able to obtain academic goals and can only focus on, say, life skills. So if you have something in your IEP, some accommodation, right, that you use for the student, you also have to talk about how, and that's something that you give as an example of alignment. So for instance, in this one case, you have a student with visual needs and you provide a slant board because it's accommodation suggested in their IEP. But if you don't talk about how that slant board helps that student acquire the learning goal, even though it might be abundantly obvious, then you are not going to get that score of a 3, and it's going to be listed as a 2, which is vague. And a 2, more than 7 2s, and you're probably not going to pass your 7 state requirements. So you don't want to get a 2 if you can avoid it. You definitely want to get some 4s to bolster you in case you do get some 1s and 2s. Hopefully you won't get any 1s. Those are more rare. A 3 asks for consistent alignment. So that word consistent suggests that you want to explain how the materials align with the learning goal. Say you only take one area, just materials. Then you want to talk about that across all 3 objectives. Or if it's the same across all 3 objectives, you want to talk about how materials are aligned and how supports are aligned. Again, probably one of those would get you the score, but that word consistent is a little bit ambiguous there. How consistent should consistency be? It would be more than one example. And especially if you want to get a 4. Now, to get a 4, again, you can get a 3 with just consistent alignment, and you can completely leave off the measurable outcomes. But if you want to get a 4, you have to include a measurable outcome. A measurable outcome is not, I asked my student to run, but how far or for how long. It's some quantitative value. So this becomes a little trickier where you have to translate sometimes things that are in the writing area into something that's quantitative. So for instance, supposing you're looking to teach your student to cite textual evidence, right? Then you need to have some quantitative score where maybe you have some piece of text that has 5 sentences that could legitimately be considered textual evidence for whatever case that student is making. And your requirement is that they obtain all 5 of those pieces of evidence, or they get 3 out of 5 of them, or what have you. And then to get a solid 4, so even though you have alignment and measurable outcomes, you can't score a 4, even though this is at 4B, unless you also explain how this, the sequencing of one of those areas moves the learner towards the learning goal. So supposing you talk about your supports diminishing over the course of the lesson objectives, or let's say that your materials they move from concrete to pictures, representations to symbolic, like numerals, for instance. So more and more of the understanding is less and less connected to the context in front of the student, but it's this salient abstracted idea that they can then carry to any context. Let's say your lessons themselves have a logical sequence where skill A needs to be learned in order to master skill B, and A and B need to be done in order to get to skill C. So it might be obvious, but consider the TPA as like a court case. You have to provide evidence. And then finally, to get a 5, there is no place on the commentary where this question gets asked. This is only on the rubric, right? So how do you teach the student to generalize, maintain, or self-direct? So under 1D, you have to add a whole new paragraph for this. Now, in general, I don't recommend that you try to get 5s because that's just too much pressure on yourself, and there's no value in getting all 5s on the TPA. What that says is you're solidly a novice teacher. It doesn't say you're a better teacher, because the validity of this measurement tool is to measure if you're a novice, not if you're expert. However, getting 5s is a good idea because you have the most control over task 1. So one of the dilemmas that candidates often feel about this is, how can I'm in my student teaching weeks, I'm going to be done with this class in less than the school year. So maybe by November, I'm done my student teaching assignment. And I'm never going to have a chance to make sure that this student generalizes this new learning or maintains it, right? Well, the TPA is not asking you if in your lesson plans you actually did this with your focus learner. They're asking you, do you know to do this? Can you plan to do this, even if you don't get to enact it with this particular focus learner? So the TPA is centered in you and what you know to do, not in what you actually did with a particular focus learner, although that's often used in your scoring. So to generalize a lesson, you're going to take it to a new context. So supposing for a high school student, you teach a math concept, and then later you can say in their science lesson that we give in 2 weeks, we're going to use this division of fractions in order to, and talk about the task that you're going to accomplish. So that's an example of a generalization. A maintenance kind of activity would be repeated periodic review. So you might say every 3rd Friday of every month, we'll review these concepts with a card game. And then self-directed, I've talked about this, but it's you're teaching the student how to practice an activity without you being there. So if you were to get up and walk away, can your student do the activity and know that they're correct? Not just feel that they're correct, but actually know that they're correct enough to move on, graph their score, and feel that they've accomplished something, that they know what they've accomplished, or they know what they've accomplished. So that's what that means. The submission limits are here. So just let me briefly talk about this because this gets complicated. Your task 1 commentary in total, so rubric 1 through rubric 5 together, you have 12 pages to complete it. You can add up to 5 pages of key instructional material. So you might have 12 worksheets that you give the student, but what of those worksheets do you reference in rubrics 1 through 5 that you then need to include it, because you can only include 5 pages. Your lesson plans may not be more than 4 pages per lesson. Now, the EdTPA police are not going to come after you on this one if it's longer. I just wouldn't abuse that one. And then you're going to have blank assessments, which would be written. Now, if your student doesn't read, obviously you're not going to have a written assessment, and you will show an example of you assessing that student, say an audio or video recording in task 3. So if you don't have written assessments, you can just leave that off here. But if you do, there's no limit to the page number on those. So quick commercial here. This quick and dirty, hopefully I've hit the key points for rubric 1 that you need to know to pass this on your own. However, I do have a more detailed course. It's over an hour of recording.